I never thought moving to Seattle would be this unsettling. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a new job, a new city, and my very own apartment. The building was old but charming, with creaky wooden floors and an elevator that groaned like it carried the weight of the world. Apartment 3B was mine. It started with the small things. At first, I blamed my own scatterbrained nature. I'd come home from work and find my mail already sitting on the counter. Odd, since I knew I hadn't picked it up. Then there were the little items that seemed to move on their own. My keys would be on the kitchen table instead of the hook by the door. My favorite mug, which I always kept in the cabinet, was once sitting in the sink, still damp. I chalked it up to exhaustion and maybe some forgetfulness. But then the notes started. At first, they were harmless. A folded piece of paper slipped under my door with a simple, "You look nice today." I thought it was sweet, maybe even flattering. But as the days went by, they became more unsettling. "I like the way you hum when you cook." Or worse, "You should lock your windows at night." That's when I started to feel it, the constant weight of being watched. I tried to tell myself it was paranoia. Maybe the city was just getting to me. But then came the night of the footsteps. It was late, and I was in bed, struggling to fall asleep. The building was quiet, as usual, except for the faint sound of rain against the windows. Then I heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. They stopped just outside my door. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst. I sat frozen, straining to hear. The knob rattled gently, as if someone was testing it. I'd never been more thankful for the deadbolt. The next morning I found another note, this time taped to my door. "You're even prettier when you're scared." That was it. I called the building manager, but he brushed it off. "It's an old building," he said. "Sometimes the locks are tricky. Maybe you're just imagining things." Imagining things? I wanted to scream, but I didn't. Instead, I started keeping a knife under my pillow and checked the locks on every window and door twice before bed. The breaking point came a week later. I was in the shower when I heard noise in the apartment, a faint creak, like someone stepping on the floorboards. I turned off the water, heart racing, and listened. Silence. I grabbed my towel and stepped out into the hallway, dripping wet and trembling. That's when I saw it. Muddy footprints leading from my front door to the living room. I didn't think. I ran back to the bathroom, locked the door, and called 911. My voice shook as I explained what was happening. "Someone's in my apartment. Please, hurry." Minutes felt like hours. I pressed my ear to the bathroom door, trying to hear any movement. Then came the sound of the front door slamming shut. When the police arrived, the apartment was empty. They found no signs of forced entry, but the muddy footprints were proof enough that I wasn't losing my mind. They promised to patrol the area more often and suggested I stay with a friend for a few days. But I had no friends in Seattle, no one to turn to. So I stayed, sleeping with the lights on and the knife within reach. A few nights later, I heard the footsteps again. This time, I didn't freeze. I grabbed my phone, dialed 911, and crept to the kitchen, where I kept a heavy frying pan. The door burst open before I could react. A man stood there, tall and shadowy, his face obscured by a hood. He didn't speak, just took a step toward me. I swung the pan as hard as I could, connecting with his shoulder. He stumbled but didn't go down. I screamed, louder than I ever thought possible, and kept swinging until he finally turned and bolted out the door. The police caught him a few blocks away. His name was Eric, and he lived in the building next door. He'd been watching me for weeks, breaking in while I was at work or asleep. I moved out the next day. Now every creak of a floorboard or shadow outside my window sends my heart racing. I've learned to trust my instincts, but the fear lingers like a scar. I survived, but part of me will always wonder, what if I hadn't? When we moved into the house on Briarwood Lane, it felt like a dream come true. The towering Victorian, with its iron gate and sprawling garden, seemed almost too perfect. My husband, Jake, our kids, Sarah and Noah, and I, were ready to build a lifetime of memories there. But the house had a different plan. From the moment we stepped inside, something felt wrong. The air was heavy, oppressive, as though the house was holding its breath. The feeling wasn't immediate, it crept in over time, an invisible weight that grew stronger the longer we stayed. It began innocently enough. A few days after moving in, I was unpacking boxes in the kitchen when I heard a faint dragging sound from above. I froze. It wasn't just a creak or a groan. It was deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across the attic floor. Jake said it was probably squirrels. I wanted to believe him. But then Sarah, our 8-year-old, started complaining about whispers in the night. She swore someone was standing outside her bedroom, their shadow stretching across the gap beneath her door. She begged us to leave the hallway light on, but even then, she'd wake up crying. Noah, our 4-year-old, was quieter about it, but one day he pointed to an empty corner of the living room and said, "The man's sitting there." When I asked him what man, he just shrugged. "The man who lives here," he said, as if it were obvious. Jake brushed it off, but the house wouldn't let us ignore it. The back door, which we always locked, started unlocking itself. The old rocking chair in the living room would sway on its own, slow and steady, like someone was sitting there, lost in thought. At night, I'd lie in bed, listening to footsteps creaking up and down the hallway. Sometimes I thought I saw shapes in the shadows, figures that melted away the moment I turned to look. The worst night came when the kids were staying with my mom. Jake and I had just finished dinner and were settling in to watch a movie when the lights began to flicker. At first it seemed random, but then it became rhythmic, almost purposeful, as though someone was playing with the switch. "That's it," I whispered. "We need to check the house." Jake opened the door to the hallway, and that's when we saw it. The back door was wide open, swinging gently on its hinges. We rushed outside, but the yard was empty, eerily still. No wind, no sound, just an unnatural silence. When we turned to go back in, we noticed something on the ground by the door, a single muddy footprint. It was large, far too large to belong to any of us, and so fresh it looked like it had just been made. We searched the house from top to bottom, but nothing seemed out of place, until I spotted the suitcase. It was sitting in the corner of the upstairs hallway, dusty and old, with leather straps that looked ready to crumble. I opened it, half expecting something horrific inside, but there was only a single photograph, faded and yellowed with age. It was a picture of the house, taken decades ago. Standing on the front porch was a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. The man's face caught my eye immediately. It was strangely familiar. I flipped the photo over. Written on the back, in shaky handwriting, was a name, John McAllister. I didn't know the name, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen that face before. After some digging, I found out that John McAllister had been the house's previous owner. He'd lived there for decades with his family before dying in the late 1980s. But his death hadn't been peaceful. John suffered from dementia in his final years. He often wandered the neighborhood, knocking on doors, confused and desperate to find his way back home. When he died, neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the house. Footsteps, voices, even the faint sound of a rocking chair creaking. It all made sense now. The whispers, the footsteps, the unlocked doors, it was John. He hadn't moved on. This was still his home, and we were the intruders. The realization didn't bring peace, though. If anything, it made the house feel heavier, darker. Every shadow felt like it held his presence. Every creak, a reminder that we weren't alone. To this day, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, certain that someone is standing at the foot of my bed, watching. When I walk through the hallway, I feel a chill, as though John is still there, waiting in his rocking chair, longing for a family that's long gone. I lived in an apartment complex that was built in the 1970s or 1980s. It had been a premier property back in the day, but over the years its best days had faded. The complex housed a mixed population and was built on uneven ground, historically located on Native American lands. The area was also known for numerous skirmishes and deaths. I lived in 2 different units within the complex. Initially, I stayed in a midsection apartment on the 2nd floor near the management office. I didn't have major issues there aside from a mouse problem. However, the last straw came when I finally saw a roach. That prompted me to move out. The ladies in the office offered me an apartment at the other end of the building with updated furnishings. It was a corner unit on the 3rd floor, far from the roaches. I was thrilled with the offer because I had always wanted to live on the top floor in a corner unit. Fewer neighbors and no footsteps above me. Or so I thought. At first, I was satisfied with the move. Once I settled in, the new unit seemed perfect. It was quiet, with no roaches and far fewer mice. Eventually, I broke the lease due to the mice, but I digress. My partner at the time, now my wife, and I began experiencing something odd. We heard footsteps above us every day, even though we were on the top floor. The footsteps seemed to follow us, moving from the bedroom to the living room. I started noticing a pattern. At night, when we went to bed and settled in, we would hear footsteps entering the room. They would pace in a circle in the corner and then stop, as if something had settled there. The same thing happened when we went into the living room. The footsteps would follow us, circle in the corner, and stop. The complex had a slanted roof, so I considered the possibility that someone might be in the attic space. But why would they choose to be directly above our apartment? And why would they follow us from room to room? If someone were hiding in an attic, they would likely try to stay as quiet as possible to avoid exposure. That theory didn't add up. I also ruled out neighbors downstairs because the sound distinctly came from above, and it often felt as though it was inside our apartment. Eventually, I concluded that the apartment was haunted by a spirit. I mentioned this to my partner, but she preferred to ignore such things due to her spiritual background. She believed in spirits but avoided engaging with them unless she felt threatened. I, on the other hand, didn't mind spirits and was open to the paranormal. I even consider myself somewhat of a demonologist. I had once contemplated becoming a priest to pursue exorcism, but ultimately decided against it because I wanted a family and respected the responsibilities of the cloth. I've been told I have the gift of discernment. I can sense truths about people, see things from the past, and occasionally have visions of the future. But I digress. As for the entity in the apartment, I kept seeing an image in my mind's eye. A white man in his mid to late 20s, with a beard and a somewhat disheveled appearance. He wore a flannel shirt and blue jeans. This man seemed to follow us from room to room, walking upside down on the ceiling, pacing in a circle, and then sitting cross-legged, silently watching us during our routines. One particularly significant experience happened when my partner wasn't home. She lived close by, so close that I could see her place from my apartment. One evening she left for the night, and I went to bed alone. As I began to drift off to sleep, I felt my bed start to shake. I stayed calm and tried to assess my surroundings. I listened for the faint rumble of the train several miles away, which we could occasionally feel when it passed. But there was no train. I thought I might have a pinched nerve, so I shifted my position. Now lying on my back, the bed continued to shake. Harder this time. At that point, I became genuinely concerned. I'd never experienced anything like it before. Thinking it might be spiritual, I said the Our Father prayer. The bed continued to shake for about 30 seconds after I finished praying. I called my partner and asked if she wanted to come back and stay the night. She agreed, but shared her own strange experience. When she arrived at her place earlier that evening, she went to open her locked bedroom door, but it wouldn't budge. She pushed and turned the handle with all her strength, but it wouldn't move. Frustrated, she called her grandmother for help. Her grandmother, who was wise and spiritually attuned, came to the door, cranked the handle as hard as she could, and pushed. Eventually, the door gave way. This incident happened around the same time my bed was shaking. The timing was eerie and felt more than coincidental.